Thank you so much again. Let's begin with this. Iran and the US began another round of nuclear talks last Friday in Muscat in Oman. But the last year, they also held 5 rounds of talks, which concluded with 12-day Iran-Israel war. Do you think that this round of talks can lead to something more than war? Can we expect some sort of deal this time?
I think, Rosine, we're talking about talks. That's the first thing. When we finally had this meeting last week between the U.S. and the Iranian delegations, it was merely an indirect negotiation brokered by the Omanis, and to say, okay, well, everybody's in the same place. To get to the fundamentals here, if you're really talking seriously about talks, you would have to say, okay, what's on the table regarding Iran's nuclear program? And at this point, Iran is showing no indication that it's willing to scrap enrichment entirely. And indeed, they have had decades of enrichment of civilian purposes, and were even allowed enrichment up to 3.67% under the 2015 agreement. Reports are that the Trump camp is trying to tell the Iranians you have to get rid of enrichment entirely. Sometimes there's contradictory public statements. But if the Americans are saying that, there's no way that you're going to get an agreement here. The second issue is, are you discussing negotiations that go beyond Iran's nuclear program? Now, for the Iranians, they've said, we'll discuss our nuclear program, but we're not going to discuss anything else which is related to the military, including ballistic missiles. Well, the Trump camp say, no, you have to discuss ballistic missiles as well, something that the Iranians have always refused to do. Thirdly, then you discuss the economic side of this. Okay, if Iran limits its nuclear program, are we talking about a complete lifting of the American sanctions? And remember, it was Donald Trump who imposed the comprehensive sanctions in 2018. Are you talking about a phased lifting of the sanctions, which is what the 2015 agreement was about? What does it mean to lift sanctions? And then I think, fourthly, on top of that, you just have to realize that we're not talking about a single U.S. and a single Iran here. I mean, when you talk about the U.S., you have the people in the State Department, in the CIA, in the military, what you might consider the career people. But the Trump camp, which is much more chaotic, it's Donald Trump who simply wants the Nobel Peace Prize. And then wants to appear tough at the same time. It's Steve Witkoff, who's a real estate developer, who doesn't really know that much about Iran or the Middle East. And it's Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. Again, a guy who effectively is a consultant for big financial deals. That's what Kushner does. I think if I was to summarize this, I think the reason why you're having talks about talks is, from the American side, it's because of this Trump ego project. And I don't want to say it is not serious. It's a serious issue, the Iran nuclear project. But this is a Trump ego project, as it was with North Korea. I'd like to be seen to be doing peace. But it is also a project which is trying to show American dominance still in the region. And from the Iranian side, at least from the standpoint of the regime, it's to buy time. And by time, they have suffered this war, and it was a very damaging 12-day war that the Israelis launched last June. They're suffering from a great deal of international isolation. And I think first and foremost right now, they're suffering from pressure within Iran. They're suffering pressure which links the economic and the social issues, which is why we saw the surge in protest, which were put down probably at the cost of tens of thousands of lives over the past couple of months.
Yes, I think, yes, as you describe it, the gap between this, like US and Iran, is very wide. And so far, as you mentioned, there is no indication that the Iranian officials are flexible towards zero uranium enrichment at home, and something that the U.S. official, they all want zero uranium enrichment inside Iran. But also at the same time, yesterday we saw Netanyahu after his visit his visit with Trump. he said that Trump is aligned with Israel on ballistic missile program of Iran, and for the Iranian officials, this is a red line, and they think this is part of our pillar strategy. Like it is one of the most central pillar of our strategy. And another issue is also proxy networks of Iran, and Iran says this is important pillar of my revolutionary ideology. If I give this up, then that means end of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, but at the same time, parallel to this diplomacy and diplomatic talks or talks just about talks of talks, we also see that the U.S. Continues its military build up in the region. Like yesterday, the president of the US, Trump, just announced that the second aircraft carrier is going to be deployed in the region by Pentagon. This does this mean that if diplomacy fail, and it seems that neither side are open to give any concession, so does this mean if diplomacy fail, then the U.S. under Trump administration might trigger some sort of military action against Iran?
We don't know. But the point is the tactic here, by displaying this large amount of military force through the naval power and the air power, which is based on those warships, is to keep everyone guessing, especially to keep the Iranians guessing, because you're trying to put pressure on them to accept your demands. More broadly, this is simply the style of the Trump camp. I mean, if you think about what they did for months with Venezuela, when they blew up those boats in the Caribbean, and when they put more than 10 warships off the coast of Venezuela, including another aircraft carrier, it wasn't about drugs. I mean, I can explain to you why it wasn't about that. And it was not fundamentally about Venezuela's relations with Iran. It was fundamentally because the Trump administration was putting pressure on Venezuela to change its approach, to accept effectively American dominance. Of course, we know how that has wound up, the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president. I don't think that's going to happen with Iran. I don't think we're talking about the kidnapping of the supreme leader. But I think the use of the pressure is the same. And indeed, if you think about it with what the Trump administration tried to do, even with its allies, they threatened military action against Greenland to seize that from Denmark. Now, at the end of the day, they never actually deployed warships off the coast of Greenland. But they repeatedly said, until they were forced to back down, oh, this option is still, it's not off the table, right? Now, I think the question you're asking that I can't predict as an analyst is if the talks go nowhere, does Trump then say, that's it, we're going to carry out strikes again? He did not do that with North Korea. He threatened fire and fury in North Korea. He never did that. He got his photo opportunity with Kim, and that was enough. I think the dimension here, and we may talk about this in a minute, is it's one thing to threaten to use force against Iran. But if you use that force, especially given that it's only 8 months after the Israeli war, you're going to set off possible regional consequences. And this will affect Iraq. It'll affect Syria. It will affect the Gulf states. It will affect Lebanon, even affect Palestine. And you're going to set off consequences possibly within Iran that you can't foresee, which is going to happen. My bet would be is if the U.S. strikes, it'll be token strikes, what we call demonstration strikes. They'll hit one or two targets, a few targets. I don't think you're talking about, a widespread U.S. pattern of strikes here, because the effect across the region is going to be too great. The Americans can pretend they control things. They don't.
Yeah, you talked about Venezuela case, and I think at the moment I see many observers actually say that what the U.S. did with Venezuela, that created a blueprint for what I heard they use the term regime alteration rather than regime change. So I see also some observers talk about the idea that this military buildup in the region that might put necessary pressure on Iran's economy. It's going to choke off the Iran's oil flow. And that economic pressure might help to crack elite, like the security forces, and to open a
Yeah.
conflict inside Iran, and that might bring a regime alteration. So, do you think is that possibility that can all this economic pressure, if, for example, we see the U.S. Military
No.
presence in the region, it will be hard for Iran to export oil. We already see some reports
No.
that Iran export oil to China decrease. So, and we know that
No.
without that, they cannot control their security apparatus. So, do you think that military present there, even if it's not used for military intervention or strike or anything, but can itself bring some division, conflict within the Iranian elite
No.
and security forces?
I think the first part of that, in terms of economic pressure, I think is absolutely right. I mean, I think if you go back to 2013, the reason why the supreme leader almost was forced to accept negotiations, which included the Americans as well as the Europeans, was because the then president, President Rouhani, went to him, presented him with a dossier, and said, "Here's the serious issues we have in our economy." And that in part led to the 2015 agreement. But Iran has had serious economic problems again since 2018 with the renewal of the sanctions and with mismanagement in the economy. So they've been under this pressure for several years. Why should they crack now? And I think that brings me to the part where I have to say that you have to distinguish between Venezuela and Iran. The systems are different here. What they could do in Venezuela is they could effectively reach out to part of the system, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, and probably, although it's not clearly stated, to the interior minister and the defense ministers. And those people said effectively, okay, we'll give up Maduro, right? But even then, realize that even though you've got that regime alteration, the U.S. has not been able to re-enter the Venezuelan oil market. I mean, we're talking months, maybe years, before they get back into Venezuela's oil production, as opposed to seizing tankers with oil. Now, let's talk about Iran. Look, what you have seen, including over the last couple of months, and I must say this quite clearly, I am a supporter of Iranians in Iran who protest, who want rights. I would like there to be that type of regime alteration to provide rights, not regime change, but regime alteration. But what you saw here is that when Iran was under the greatest pressure from protests since 2009, that the leadership didn't crack, right? The Revolutionary Guards did not turn against the supreme leader. The besieged paramilitary did not turn against him. President Pezeshkian, is he your alternative to the supreme leader? Probably not. The salient point here is that the alternative that the Americans were floating was Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah. And I have to say this with respect, having worked in Iran, having many friends inside Iran, I'm not sure how much support Pahlavi has within Iran. The fundamental here is that the people you could talk about being part of a new Iranian government, a new Iranian leadership, many of them have been in prison for years. The regime has been very effective in decapitating other groups, whether we talk about some of the leaders of the Green Movement, like Mir Hossein Mousavi, who probably would have won the 2009 election, under house arrest since 2011, Mehdi Karoubi, also a candidate in 2009, house arrest from 2011 2025. The former minister Tajideh, who's been in prison effectively almost all of the period since 2009. I could give you a whole list of student leaders, labor leaders, NGO leaders, as well as politicians. So the idea that you could just sweep into Iran and just like, boom, here you go, alter your regime, doesn't work. And it doesn't work for another bigger reason behind this. Look, even my friends in Iran, many of my friends in Iran who want to change the system, who want reform, in some cases, they want the supreme leader to go. They don't want this to be done by the Americans or the Israelis. In 1953, this marks out Iranian history that the U.S. and Britain put the Shah back on the throne when Iran had a government that was pursuing nationalization. In 2003, next door in Iraq, America brought in the people supposedly to lead Iraq, like Ahmad Chalabi, who had very little support. And the Americans who ran the bureaus, well, they did not run them effectively enough because you saw that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died in the aftermath. So Iranians can both say, we want change within our country, And we don't want this change to come through the threat of force from outside because it poisons our movement. Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe, spread the word, send ideas.